Okay, welcome everyone to today's webinar. This is Louis Coppola from Governance and Accountability Institute, and this webinar is part of Governance and Accountability Institute's educational webinar series. In case you missed it, each of the previous webinars and this webinar will be available for download on our website. It's ga-institute.com from the webinar menu up on the top. Our most recent webinar, which took place at the end of March, was focused on the CDP investor questionnaire. And we had guest speakers, Simon Fischweicher, the manager of disclosure services at CDP. We had Emily Newton, who's a sourcing manager at FMC Corporation, who shared her experience responding to CDP, and Bridget Realmuto, the senior research associate at Domini Impact Investments, who explained the way that Domini uses the CDP response data in their investment-making decision processes. Our February webinar featured Robert Dornow of RebeccoSAM, the creators of the Dow Jones Sustainability Indexes, and Evan Harvey from NASDAQ, discussing the importance of responding to the RebeccoSAM Corporate Sustainability Assessment, which is actually currently in the open period. Right now, G&A is assisting many of our clients in responding to this important investor assessment before the deadline, which closes around the end of May. And prior to that, the first webinar in this series, we had Allison Genovese, who's the head of corporate stakeholder relations for the US and Canada for GRI, to discuss the transition from the GRI G4 to the new GRI standards. By 2018, all companies reporting using the GRI G4 will need to utilize the new GRI standards to be GRI compliant. So this too is a hot engagement area that we're working with clients on gap analysis to make sure that they're prepared for the next year. So today we welcome an excellent group of experts to discuss another very important investor-led disclosure standard, GRESB. GRESB is an investor-driven organization committed to assessing the ESG performance of real assets globally. There's more than 250 members, of which more than 60 are pension funds and their fiduciaries. They use the GRESB data in management and engagement processes with a clear goal to optimize the risk-return profile of their investments. Our guests today include Ulrich Scarf, the Director of IT and Analytics for GRESB. Ulrich is responsible for the development of GRESB products and IT infrastructure, and he co-develops the GRESB scoring algorithm. Prior to joining GRESB, Ulrich worked for Commerce Bank. We also have Matt Ellis, the founder and CEO of Measurabl, a great partner of the Governance and Accountability Institute, and the leading provider of precision software built to help you collect, report, and act upon non-financial data. We utilize Measurabl's technology with many of G&A's clients, and we found it to be tremendously useful in simplifying the data collection and reporting process, all while helping to bring that data up to investor-level quality, making sure that it's decision useful and dependable for investors and other important stakeholders. And finally, we have with us today Mark DeLisi, the Senior Director of Corporate Responsibility at Avalon Bay Communities. During the past 18 years, he's directed programs that advance corporate responsibility, global sales success, talent development and leadership training, and employee and customer engagement. In the mix of Mark's extensive work in this area, GRESB has been their disclosure. The flow of today's webinar will start with the discussion and presentations from each of our three guest experts, and then we'll have a short message from G&A Institute before we move on to the Q&A part of our webinar today. So please send questions to me, Louis Coppola, via the chat function of the tool as the presentation goes along, and I'll make sure to queue those up so that at the end of the presentations, we can get through as many as we can. And we hope that we have a lot of questions, so please feel free to send them along to me. So this webinar will also be recorded, and it will be available for review on the G&A website. We'll also be sharing the slides with the participants after the call, so if you miss something, we'll have that to you shortly after. So we look forward to hearing about this exciting topic from our experts today, and we look forward to a live Q&A session and a lot of participation. So please remember to send your questions to me via the chat function. And now I will hand it off to Ulrich to take it from the top and give us some insight about what GRESB is and why it's critical for your organization to consider.
Yeah, thanks, Luis, for the excellent introduction and also summary of what GRESB does. For the first 10 minutes, my aim is to really take a zoom out perspective and address what is GRESB, what its philosophy, how it's relevant, and from there on I will quickly zoom into the element of connecting to external data systems as Measurabl and why this is so important for the reporting process. So as Luis described, I'm at GRESB responsible for all IT and analytics and products we create out of that, and in that sense very much focused on the question of where do we get the data from, how do we validate that data, how do we store that data, and how do we create great output out of that. But with further ado, let's move to the first slide where I'm trying to address on the highest level what we do. In our mission statement, we say that we enhance and protect shareholder value by assessing and empowering sustainability practices in the real asset sector. Broken down, this means we run an annual framework to analyze the ESG performance of portfolios. These information are self-reported by respondents, but we validate them, we score them, and out of that in combination, we create analytical products that are both used by the investor as well as by the fund manager or REIT themselves. We additionally do this for real assets, so that's beyond real estate. We cover infrastructure, we cover debt portfolios, and try to really, for institutional investors that are exposed to all three investment classes, provide a standardized framework that creates comparability. Moving to the next slide, I want to highlight and address the philosophy of how this creates positive change. From my personal perspective, reporting to any tool, reporting to any framework is first and foremost an administrative cost. It's an effort that's taken by the organization to collect information, to report them, and to essentially enter them into forms. So it's very important to me that that effort and that investment by the organization is always justified by positive impact. And we at GRESB believe that this positive impact really comes through that dynamic and the relationship with the capital providers, and specifically a top-down approach from capital flow. So the way we basically see this market is that as from the investment community, capital flows to investment managers, and from there on down the chain to companies, portfolios, and buildings, that capital flow increasingly also comes to with commitment to increase or achieve certain ESG performances. We want to create in this dynamic transparency. We want to create a tool and a platform and a framework that allows to investors to benchmark and compare the performance of their investments, to not only make capital allocation decisions, but also to create a continuous and meaningful engagement with their investments. On the next slide, moving forward, I want to address a little bit the rationale of why this is so important in capital markets. And as you see here in this curve, we map out an imaginary building stock and compare it over the sustainability performance. And in this graph, if we think of organizations like USBC or BRE or Green Star in Australia, building level certifications really do an outstanding job of highlighting what are the best practices around sustainability and ESG for buildings. But investors mostly perceive and think about this from a risk management perspective. So they're concerned about possible new regulation that imposes new standards in terms of energy efficiency. They're concerned about changes in tenant demand. They're generally concerned about any changes in the market that really favor long-term thinking and progression, like and the focus on sustainability. So in that sense, they're not so much interested in the green area, although that's certainly an important aspect. They need to know what is under the entire other area of that curve. And they want to see that that curve, and especially not so good assets under that curve, move forward to the right. So when you click on the next slide, Louis, you will see a little animation, which is not so important. But this means that GRESB's mission essentially is to understand everything that's under the curve. On the next slide, I just want to highlight a little bit on the problematic and the aspect of the scale this means. The entire curve represents obviously a huge amount of capital. So as we go to the next slide, you probably need to click again. Thank you. I just want to compare a little bit the scale and show the sheer volume. So the one dot represents 100 billion US dollars here, and we take the most valuable company in the world, Apple, which is worth 760 billion US dollars on the next slide. And clicking again on that, we see that the entire commercial real estate sector is around worth 7.6 trillion US dollars. Of that, in the next animation, GRESB covers today 2.8 trillion. I think actually by now it's 3.2 trillion US dollars. So that's a huge volume of buildings and assets that all on their own generate a vast amount of data. And that challenge of understanding all of that data makes it very, very, very relevant for GRESB to work with as many partners that capture that data in the most meaningful way. On clicking on the next slide, the investors' perspective on all of this is pretty much that the green dots, no, if we go one back, the green dots in this graph show competitive differentiation and advantage, meaning that investors that can use the GRESB data for these 2.8 trillion US dollars are able to understand the sustainability performance of their assets, while for all of the other assets and portfolios that are not covered by the framework, it just simply means uncertainty and risk. It doesn't mean that these assets or portfolios are worse necessarily, but it certainly means to investors that they don't understand them. So this means that we need to understand the scale and the entire scope of these portfolios. On the next slide, we can see that for GRESB, this is also a global problem. We run this analysis in very different regions with very different data structures, very different data flows, practices on how to manage it. And as a result, again, we need to work with as many professional and good local partners as possible. On the next slide, I basically go through a series of, again, showing the scale in terms of our reporting. As Lou mentioned at the beginning, we work with around 60 institutional investors and analyze at that point in time 760 different property companies and portfolios. Those property companies and portfolios own 66,000 assets in our framework, and that excludes any residential or small single unit. So we're talking about 66,000 large-scale commercial real estate assets. And that as a number is large, but when you look at the meter information and all the information that these buildings generate, it's a crazy vast amount. So on the next slide, it basically means that this block of data we need to analyze covers environmental information about each asset. It covers geospatial information, meaning where is this building located and what does it tell us about the building, and also qualitative information, referring to questions as when was the last energy efficiency assessment that was done for this building. And on the next slide, on top of that, these different scope and forms of data come with different requirements. So we aim as GRESB to a format of investment grade data, meaning that data that is reported and goes through this framework and through all of these buildings is of a standard that really allows them to base investment decisions on the basis of this data. Additionally, we want to achieve that the data for all of these buildings flows automatic, meaning that in an ideal world, it basically flows directly from the meter reading automatically to the analytics that are presented to the investor at the end of the day. And it should be done with as little administrative burden as possible. I'm fully aware that today we are certainly not in a world where all information is investment grade data or is automatic, or that reporting to GRESB would be an easy thing. But looking a little bit forward, our perspective is that we see an ecosystem of great solutions emerging to solve these three problems essentially for our respondents. And on the next slide, I highlight a little bit this flow of data. So while GRESB itself is able to digest spatial information, meaning we can understand where a building is located and what that means weather-wise and other factor-wise, we also pull in data from all kinds of certifications and ratings from global databases. But this does not give us any performance data or real information of what's happening in the buildings. So moving forward in the next slide, we focus on building relationships to external data partners that are able to prepare and aggregate all of these information for our respondents and then automatically put them into our system. And that relationship basically connects us on the next slide through the external data partners, the fund managers and REITs, and generally the owners of these portfolios that, again, in those systems manage their buildings and the individual meters in these buildings through building accounts. On the next slide, this relationship of the building and the information that are collected by systems as measurables allows us to feed in metered information, so that's typically energy and water, but also calculated values as GHG and waste, and increasingly important qualitative information. So to round this all up, I started with establishing the importance for investors and why this is highly relevant to their decision-making and monitoring of assets. From there, I went to the vast scale of information and data that needs to be aggregated under the standards of investment grade, optimization, and reduced administrative burden, and showed that our data need is essentially satisfied by the approach of cooperating with organizations like Measurabl and other data partners, as shown on the next slide, that really are able to solve that problem in an accurate and meaningful way on the local level, and then from there on can feed the information to a more systematic and high-level framework as ours. So here you see the collection of organizations we work with, and yeah, I believe I have the honor now to hand over to Measurabl and Matt Alice, who can explain more of how this works on a detailed level.
Thank you, Ulrich.
Perfect. Thanks.
Yeah, fabulous job. Everyone, welcome to the call. And I think our job here in the next set of slides is to begin to dive into the data itself and speak very tactically. How does reporting get accomplished? I think Ulrich provided a very good understanding of why we report to GRESB, why this is so essential for our industry of real estate owners and investment managers and investors to bring transparency to sustainability data and performance, because it's fundamentally linked to the financial performance of these assets. And that's what investors and owners care about. So the question for Measurabl to address today is, how does this happen? So Lou, if you go to the next slide, we'll restate that problem, right? When from an owner's perspective, the issue at hand is we must measure, manage, and report. And there's a tremendous amount of information that a disclosure standard like GRESB, or as Lou mentioned earlier, CDP, requires to have a comprehensive and authoritative measure of sustainability performance. Things like meter level data, spatial data, building size, type, location, the number of projects and type of projects being performed. And when we begin to think about the diversity of this information, and you realize that this isn't just one building that we're reporting on, but portfolios of perhaps hundreds, even thousands of buildings, the complexity can compound and compound and compound. If we do not address this complexity with a scalable and systematic process, and Measurabl would argue that's fundamentally a software process, there is no reporting whatsoever. the entire industry is blocked because it can't procure quality data in a timely fashion. So that, I think, is really the issue at hand here, is how do we get this information? How do we quality assure this information? And how we distribute this information to those that matter, like GRESB. Next slide, please, Lou. So here's the hierarchy, and I'll spend a lot of our time. We have a small number of slides, so we'll sit here for a few minutes. And maybe work from the bottom left here to notice the statement that we make, which is to do GRESB well, we believe you must work upwards from the meter level. So let's start there. A meter sits inside a building. These are electricity meters, water meters. You can even think of things like the waste hauling going on from a building as a type of a meter, each container being shipped out. These are things that are truly measurable, pun intended. And we must get that actual meter level data. And we must assign what that meter is reading. Specifically, is that a tenant meter? Is that a landlord common area meter? How do we know? If you don't know that, you're unable to truly present your organization's performance data to GRESB, to CDP, or even internally. So the problem really does sort of begin at this very basic sub-level of the building, which is the meter level. And there are a variety of techniques you can use to acquire that meter level data. Current state of the market is, I think, broadly still manual. What we see when we look out at the landscape of building owners and property managers, or corporations for that matter, is that they're getting utility data, meter level data, from their utility provider in a paper-based fashion. They're going to be entering that into some system. It might be Excel, it might be some online system, it might be a third-party software like Measurabl. But something is going on where this meter level data is coming in and then recorded. And the attributes of that meter, is it electricity? Is it therms? Is it megawatt hours? What's the unit of the consumption? What part of the building does the meter serve? These are the essential questions. And your process really is going to start there. If you do not have a command of your meters, you have a great problem, which is you're going to struggle to tell as much of anything about your building whatsoever. All right, so beginning at the meter. Now let's move to the buildings. I think Ulrich very accurately sort of captured this with that idea of geospatial, right? What is this building? There is actually a lot of difficulty even here. In the real estate universe, a building might be a single freestanding 10-story office tower. It could actually be what we call an asset, a collection of office buildings in a campus environment. Think about a corporate HQ. And if that HQ is leased and the ownership is Oxford Properties or Bentall Kennedy, and they're reporting to GRESB, is that 10 buildings, one building, one asset. And so correctly differentiating each building with a unique address, knowing which meters feed to which building, this is really simple in theory, hard in practice. And a lot of folks can struggle with that process. So the other aspects of the building then isn't just where is it, but what type of building is it? For example, in the real estate environment, you're going to find that many assets these days are mixed use. Retail on the bottom, condos on top. Retail on bottom, office on top. Medical office buildings with a portion that is standard office. Office buildings with data centers involved. They have very different tenant behaviors and very different use types. If you don't correctly differentiate this building and break it out into its use types, GRESB will struggle to score you correctly because they may think you're in fact an entire office building with very high consumption when the reality is you have a data center that's driving a lot of energy use. So it's really important for you to not just allocate meters to spaces and understand what those meters are consuming, but to define your building correctly. Is it mixed use? What types? Where is it? What is it? How big is it? What's the leasable area? These types of details matter. You're also going to want to know what projects are being performed, what certifications are attached to that building. For example, LEED, BREEAM, BOMA. There are a multitude of certifications that you might achieve with your building, and GRESB will want to know things like what percentage of your portfolio on a floor area weighted basis has achieved a LEED rating, and what level of LEED if so. So you can start to understand the complexity as it stacks up here. We need to know all our meters. We need to know what parts of the building they serve and what they are. We need to know a lot about our building. We need to know its certifications, its projects. And lastly, and probably the easiest thing you would think, is the entity level data. So this isn't just a report about individual buildings. It's actually a report, GRESB is, about the owner of those buildings and what that owner thinks, what their programs, what their policies are, what their governance practices are. These are fundamental, because if you have an ownership who's made a policy that tenant engagement around sustainability will be something every property manager does for every building, you might reasonably expect that that portfolio should score better on GRESB. In fact, it would. So we need to know things at the what we call the entity level: policies, procedures, documentation, evidence of these governance controls. We need to know things at the building level: certifications, projects, vendors, building details, geospatial information. And we need to know what's going on fundamentally at the meter level. And you can see now that this is really a triple-headed monster of detail. And it's something that if you want to attack successfully, we believe you're really always reporting to GRESB in best practice. You're always collecting meter details. You're always keeping track of projects every day, every week, every month, so that the moment of GRESB reporting is really a bundling of this data into the GRESB format in a time for it to be reviewed and quality assured systemically. Next slide, please, Luke. So let's dive a little bit here and look at those same characteristics and look at what comes from where. And we've highlighted the meters. There's an aspect in GRESB called the performance indicators aspect. It's one segment of several. And it is populated fundamentally by energy, water, waste, and carbon. Carbon is derived from the energy consumption. You apply an emissions factor based on the location of the building or the provenance of its energy to get the carbon. But look at the other things here. They're not coming from these meters at all. They're coming from the buildings as described: projects and audits, certs and ratings, stakeholder engagement, risks and opportunities, policies and procedures, all things that go into GRESB. And of these last three, you'll notice something somewhat unusual. They actually occur both at buildings and at the entity level. What's an example of this? A stakeholder engagement policy may be set at the entity level. It is executed with the tenants in any given building. So GRESB will necessarily want to know what proportion of your tenants have you in fact reached out to. We see a global policy on tenant engagement here, but how many people did you actually reach? How many tenants did you actually reach? The only way to answer that is by asking each building. So you'll notice that as we stacked up meters and buildings in the entity level, it's actually not that neat. And we really wanted to unbundle that here for you and really show you side by side where this data is actually coming from. And I think the takeaway when I look at this is that a system must be in place to collect and capture this across the whole organization. If you have this, your reporting burden will be massively lowered, because all that happens at the end here is a mapping of this information from your day-to-day sustainability practices and data collection procedures into the format of GRESB. And there's a call out here at the bottom that says most pain comes from drawing organizational boundaries and transposing quantitative data. That is true when it comes to the report creation itself. If you're already collecting data, I think you've cleared the majority of the burden here. At that point in time, it's just about choosing which buildings are in and out, following GRESB's very clear guidelines on this, and then mapping that data over into their particular format. An example is that CDP and GRESB both consume, and Mark can speak to this because they report to both, a lot of the same data. very different presentation of that same underlying data. Next slide, please, Lou. So this is just what is measurable and how do we think about the market. And I think what's interesting here is that we've tried to recognize that this data comes from lots of places. It comes in on a daily basis, perhaps from a meter at a building, or an annual basis even for policies or procedures coming from the entity. That there is a multitude of uses for this data. GRESB is one, CDP yet another, internal sustainability reporting, diagnostics yet another. And the way to think about our system, and I think where the market is now moving to, whichever system you may apply, is that there's some layer between raw data and reported data. And it is that layer's responsibility, whether it's IT or it's people, to be a Rosetta Stone, to translate between investor needs and the raw and underlying data, to be accessible to your auditors, your assurance and third-party providers, so that they have a place of record to go to get it. And so I think that the best practice here is to recognize the change in the market, the multitude of burdens placed on an organization, and that there must be something systematic in place to account for it all. Next slide, please, Lou. I think that does it for us. Thank you very much for your time and look forward to answering questions.
All right, thank you, Matt. And now we'll pass along to Mark.
Okay, thanks, Lou. Thanks, Matt. And certainly thank all of you for taking a little time here. You know, a couple of slides about Avalon Bay just to start real quick. Public equity REIT. We have 285 apartment communities. We're all multifamily. And we both develop, construct, and operate our communities. Listed on the S&P 500 and in 18 U.S. markets, primarily on both coasts. So if you go to the next slide, Lou, you can see kind of where we're located, the size of the portfolio in each of those markets, and the revenue and operating margin. I think what it is about Avalon Bay that also makes sustainability and corporate responsibility work so well is that combination of development and operation, right? So we hold our assets and we have direct control, if you will, over the way that we operate those assets. So that's a little bit about Avalon Bay. If you talk about our corporate responsibility program, if you go to the next slide, Lou, you know, I put this in here for a couple reasons. One, this is what we do in CR, right? So this is one way to look at it is we have programs in environmental sustainability, community investment, large strategic philanthropy program that we call Building Strong Communities. And certainly we have programs to engage our clients, our residents, and obviously quite a bit around associates. We definitely think that, you know, our purpose as a company, which is creating a better way to live, extends to all of our stakeholders, including associates and residents. So there's an angle to this framework around what we do, but there's also a really important angle in terms of this particular presentation and session around what we report. So I also like to say, you know, one of the jobs of corporate responsibility of sustainability professionals in any industry is to transparently report in these areas. So we, you know, really view, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, the reporting function, while it is painful, challenging, hard at times, it's an essential component to us as a 21st century company, a leader in our industry, because it's important that we let all of our stakeholders know how we're doing on the environmental, the social, and the governance. It's no longer, in my opinion, we don't live in a world where just financial reporting works anymore in terms of a company's health, in terms of its sustainability, in terms of whether you want to invest in it. So, you know, this is how we frame it. This is how we talk about it. This is how we report on it. And in terms of the reporting, if you go to the next slide, Lou, we have staked out kind of a three-part intentional reporting, if you will, and that's an annual CR report, right, which I'm in the throes of creating right now for 2016. You can see there a 2015 report cover, which covers, again, our ESG performance in those categories on the framework on the previous slide. We also submit to CDP, and we submit to GRESB. And I find that three-part reporting to be extremely beneficial for us in those areas that I was talking about before around transparency, around telling our story and getting the accurate data out there to all of our stakeholders in the categories of environment, social, and governance. And in particular, frankly, GRESB and CDP have two different kind of complementary things that they do for Avalon Bay. So CDP, we have chosen to disclose publicly. You can choose within CDP whether you keep your data private or you disclose it publicly. And in fact, even the private data is accessible to CDP members. But it's available out there publicly. So when I get all of the requests for other ESG data, I can point them to the CDP response. I can point them to our CR report. It's a really key way for us to tell this story. And then GRESB, obviously, because of our industry. It's a great benchmark for us as a real estate investment trust operating primarily in North America to see how we're doing, where we have gaps, et cetera. So I find CDP and GRESB to be quite complementary to what we're trying to do in terms of leadership in the space of sustainability. And then, of course, in addition to that, we receive requests throughout the year from a number of other stakeholders. I have regular investor conversations, and there are other, as I'm sure many of you know, raters and rankers out there who are accessing our data and asking us to fact check and validate their own ratings and rankings of the companies. So that's sort of the reporting landscape for Avalon Bay and a little bit about why we do it. If you go to the next slide, Lou, which I believe is my final slide, in thinking about this topic, a few things came to mind. I don't know that they entirely are helpful to GRESB in 60 days, right? So if you were coming here to find out how do I do GRESB in 60 days, I'm not entirely sure you're going to get that. But I think there's some key fundamental things about reporting in general that, we've learned over the years. One is that top one. You are being rated whether you intentionally report or not. So because of all those other raters and rankers out there that are accessing data from publicly available sources to evaluate your ESG performance, you can choose to ignore all of this, not submit to GRESB, not submit to CDP, not put a CR report out, but you're still going to get rated and ranked on ESG. It is a fact of life in the 21st century that that's one of the ways that companies are being evaluated. So key point there is keep your public sources up to date. I mean, we have a presence on our website. We have that publicly disclosed CDP response. We have the CR report. And part of that is because when these other raters and rankers are going out there that I am not intentionally reporting to find the data, there is accurate, Avalon Bay controlled story out there to the extent that you ever control your ESG story. So that's one of them. Second one, obviously reporting is extremely painful. I'm suffering those pains right now, as I'm sure many of you are, and I've always said this, it does some really important things for the companies that want to show leadership in the way you operate a company in the 21st century, which is to report on more than just financials. You get your story across and you do it accurately. You demonstrate commitment and transparency, right? Just by the fact that you have that story out there and that data out there. And then for me, it's a great kind of gap analysis, if you will. So one of the things about GRESB in 60 days that I would say to anybody is if you haven't done GRESB and you want to do it in 60 days, you know, and you're overwhelmed by that fact, but you know somehow you want to dip your toe in the water, go pull down the GRESB survey. And even if you're not going to submit the GRESB this year, read through it and look for your gaps, right? So do your own gap analysis and use GRESB to do that. You could also use CDP. There's a number of ways you could do that, but see it as a bit of a mirror to you to understand gaps in the company and in the program. Fourth or third bullet, I guess, really key point to me is don't report for reporting's sake. You know, again, if you had a choice in the next 60 days of, you know, improving your baseline program and your transparency and ensuring that you were doing the right things, like let's say you're at the very beginning and you had to either choose to set your strategy in CR or to start reporting on it, please set your strategy in CR. Please work on your program. And then the reporting will come and it will be a means for that transparency. But the reporting should never be seen, in my opinion, as the end and as the point, right? It is a means. And then finally, you know, get started, certainly a caveat, because we knew once we started reporting to CDP, we had already been reporting to GRESB for a few years. Once we took the step into CDP as a company, and then the further step to disclose publicly, we could not reverse that the next year, right? You're not going to stop reporting. So you do have to do a bit of an analysis too downstream to say, you know, if we're going to start doing this, we're going to do this now annually, every year around this time, and that's how we're going to commit to this space. So, you know, get started, and then, as I said earlier, don't be afraid to get started internally first. Pull down the survey, get the right people in the room, start chunking through that and looking at your gap, and get yourselves perhaps programmatically ready and having, you know, the right things, doing the things that are material to your company, your organization, and then perhaps you submit next year, right? So, you know, I think the key thing to me is I am of the opinion that you can't not report anymore in ESG data. Those days are gone, if not quickly disappearing, certainly in this industry, but have already rolled through many other industries many, many years ago. So I think you get started, but you keep in mind perhaps some of these key points. And I think, Lou, that's it for my slide.
All right, thank you. Thanks, everybody. So I'm just going to take just a couple of minutes. I'm going to move really quick through this because I want to make sure to have time for the Q&A. So please, you know, continue to send me questions through the chat. I'm going to move through this quick. Just want to give you a little background on G&A in case you don't know about us. Hank Borner and myself founded G&A in 2006. We're celebrating our 11th anniversary this year. We are focused on ES and G issues management. We are consultants serving corporate and investor clients. We both come from an issues and crisis management background. So we helped companies who had crisis events occur, like an oil spill or a product recall or a governance board issue. We helped them to respond to that in a way to minimize damage to reputation and valuation. When we formed G&A, we wanted to do this in a proactive way rather than a reactive way. So we left our crisis and issues management consulting firm owned by Interpublic Group, and we designed G&A to revolve around the buckets ES and G, just forming kind of around the time we formed G&A. GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, the most commonly used framework for sustainability reporting around the world, came to us and asked us to become the GRI's exclusive data partner in the U.S. So we analyze, you know, over 1,000 reports a year for a couple hundred data points. So we do this as a pro bono relationship. We share the data on the GRI's global reporting database, which if you're interested in learning about what other companies are reporting on or what your peers are reporting on, we added over 1,200 reports to that just last year, and that's from the US, UK, and Ireland. Other data partners around the world add their sustainability reports from the countries that they represent as well. So it's one of the largest databases of sustainability reports in the world, freely available. And I'd suggest if you're interested or just getting started or even looking at what your peers are doing, it's a great place to start. This is just showing in general the growth that we've tracked in the U.S. among the S&P 500 from 2011 to 2015. 20% of companies in the S&P reporting on sustainability or ESG, or as some of the other panelists called non-financial or extra financial information, has went from 20% in 2011 with 80% of companies not reporting to now 81% in the latest year of 2015 that we did this research, with only 1 out of 5 about companies not reporting. So that shrinking group of laggards, of losers in the capital markets when it comes to being rated and measured and gauged for sustainability is shrinking rapidly. And I just want to tell you about 3 programs we have coming up, and I'm going to cut it off after this. We have an Introduction to Corporate ESG certification. This is for investment and finance professionals for Wall Street to learn about how the leading financial institutions and data providers are starting to integrate ESG into their corporate valuations, how the CFA Institute is integrating ESG, groups like MSCI, the Bloomberg Terminal. We have guests from SASB and other organizations which are investor-led, and it's to train and get certified. So banks are sending us a team of people that they'd like to get up to speed on ESG. We have another program at Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey, May 16th and 17th. This is focused on corporate executives, on nonprofit, other adults that are involved in other areas of the business that want to learn how they can help their company with CSR, or someone working in CSR sustainability already that's looking to learn more. So it's a 2-day certification with the Rutgers Institute for Ethical Leadership. It's on May 16th and 17th. You can find out more on our website. And we also have an online certification in CR and sustainability strategies. You can do this on your own pace. It's 30 hours. It's flexible. You don't have to travel if you're from outside the area. So this quick commercial from your sponsors here. We're G&A Institute, and we've been helping companies with a variety of services that you see on the screen today. And we'd love to talk with you more if you're interested in discussing how we might be able to help you. We have a couple of websites which are freely available and useful. GAInstitute.com, sustainabilityhq.com, headquarters.com, and accountabilitycentral.com. And we have several services and social media outlets and a weekly newsletter to keep you up to speed on the most important ESG research, studies, commentary, guidelines, tips, perspectives on what's happening out there, who the players are, and what's important to be watching. It's all freely available. Feel free to visit our website and sign up. And I want to say thank you to all the participants and everyone that joined us, took time out of their day today to join the call. Now, I'm going to open it up for some Q&A. So one of the first questions that came in, I think this is an interesting question probably for a lot of people on the call. So if someone inside a company is looking to work in, get the colleagues to buy in on doing a GRESB report, sorry. What kind of questions or what kind of things should they look at in order to make the case internally, in order to pitch, making the case for putting the resources behind answering GRES? And anyone's welcome to take that.
Matt, do you want to start on that?
I actually was going to suggest Mark.
Okay. Yeah, you did it actually.
You guys punting on the first question. Ulrich, you're GRESB. You ought to be answering this one. Look, I think, I'll go back to what I said earlier. First of all, ask the question why you want to report, right? And dig into that, because for us, it was, there was real value in the reporting It's not the ends, however. So there was already in place a fairly robust program and commitment to sustainability, corporate responsibility, environmental sustainability, et cetera, ESG. And the reporting was viewed as a value add because it was going to benchmark what we were doing across peers and within our industry and even within geographies. And it was going to give us a sense to, like I said, of the gaps. So, if I had to live in an environment where I had to actually sell it, what I would go to someone with is, the value of the reporting as, a means to transparency, which is critically important in ESG work. The worst thing you can do with ESG is not report on it. It's just part and parcel to it. This is a benchmarking tool, so it's going to give us a real understanding of where we as a company stand across other companies, peers, competitors, et cetera. That usually is a good argument in favor of things. And then it's a way for us to understand where the program stands. So there's some key value adds that GRESB gives us, and then it just becomes an equation of, is the time investment then in the person hour investment going to match the value that's going to bring you? But I will say this too, we don't have teams and teams and teams of people filling this thing out, right? It's primarily me with reaching across the organization and being able to find the right people, and then also arguing in favor of them giving me a tiny slice of their time to pull the data over, to give me the data, et cetera. So that's kind of how I would answer that, Lou.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, that's interesting. This is Lou. I would add to that, if I could, that one of the things I would suggest is maybe talk with people inside the company that you may be able to get on your team. Maybe the IR department, someone in the IR department, talking to them about who are the top, say top 100 holders of your company's equity is, and comparing that to, let's say, the GRESB members or others that are using GRESB information to value the company. Perhaps in your top holders you have a pension fund or an institution that is utilizing GRESB information that maybe the investor relations department has been asked before. It's possible. And someone, depending on what type of company, the person who's dealing with the real estate, the actual lease agreements, and stuff like that. So work around, I would say, to form a multi-lateral sort of coalition of people inside the company that are willing to or that want to move in that direction could be useful and help make the case internally. So I'll go to another question. Moving on to another question. Give me 1 second. All right, this is I think a big open-ended one. Throw out there. How can I submit the best GRESB report possible?
If I may start on this one. So to start with, what is the best possible GRESB submission you can make? I think it's simply the best actual reflection of your current activities. So we always focus on making sure that GRESB shouldn't be about chasing points and so on. It should be really about communicating what do you actually do. So the best possible GRESB submission for me is simply one that most accurately reflects your activity. And on that, I know from many investors what they're looking for is, yes, they find absolute scores and where you stand in your ESG performance today interesting, but what they find more interesting is what is the track over time, meaning how does your GRESB score develop over time and can you show improvements across the organization. So I think, you know, the best possible submission from year to year really shows and demonstrates these are the real things we did across our portfolio. Submission that doesn't reflect GRESB as an end, more as a means to communicate real progress. Matt, I'm curious about your opinion on this.
I'm going to be most in agreement. I'll kind of take that one head on, and that I think the question that our clientele asks us is, how do we get the best score? I mean, to be candid, right? There is a concern. How do I get the best score? And there is an inhibition to reporting when people are fearful that they will not score well. So I agree with Ulrich that, and I think that this may be, in fact, a little bit of a disconnect in the market, to be candid, where investors are really, as Ulrich described, very much interested in performance over time and a trend and a philosophy of that organization about good stewardship of capital. Unfortunately, the ownership, the real estate asset managers, investors, look at this and have fear and trepidation that they just will not score well. So I'll answer from that perspective that if that's your concern, if you want to score well, the first thing you must do is report. GRESB, or Ulrich, you guys have the grace period option, correct?
That's correct. So,
yes. So, and I'll finish the statement, and I would like Ulrich to describe it. It's very important that people don't recognize that that's an option. Report using the grace period, which Ulrich is going to describe here for you. Then attack your weaknesses. GRESB will show you exactly where you are weak. So maybe, Ulrich, you can describe the grace period and describe the result that you give to those participants, so how they can get the best score possible if that's their concern going forward.
Yeah, so in simple, the grace period basically enables you that in your first year of reporting, none of your scores will be disclosed to your investors. So that makes the first year of reporting purely an internal exercise that gives you all the benefits of benchmarking, that shows you basically the results and the benchmarking and the comparison to peers as it is. But you also at the same time have a guarantee that this is not shared with your investors. And an interesting side part of that is the initiative to introduce the grace period in GRESB actually came from investors. Investors that are very aware of concerns and fear of a bad score for first-time respondents, but to really encourage people to onboard. And then from the second year onwards, where you went through the entire exercise already once, you can clearly show the progress. And yeah, I can only encourage everybody to use it. Reporting for GRESB is for free, and also that grace period is for free.
Yeah, let me add one thing there too, Lou, and it's a real simple one. I mean, read the guidance, right? I mean, GRESB does have a rather thick, as does CDP, and very detailed guidance on what they're looking for in each of the questions, right? So, how can you submit the best score? Roll up your sleeves, sit down, and dig through that guidance as you're answering it, and compare it to what you have programmatically.
Great, yeah. That builds on a question that came in. I think we could maybe take one or two more. If anybody needs to leave, please just let me know. But Mark, building on that, someone here has asked, what was the most challenging issue that you faced when you submitted your first GRESB report?
Well, yeah, it's a little situational, right? So when I joined Avalon Bay, we had submitted to GRESB a couple of times already. So I was picking up a bit of a baton that was already in play. I think there was part of it for me was year over year getting that story right for a year that I wasn't here, right? So there's a little bit of a challenge of submitting for a previous year's data when I wasn't here in that year, but that's more personal. I think in general, the challenge, and this does not necessarily go away, is this data, like I showed our framework on one of the slides, and you can see from that framework, the categories of data that you're pulling from are not categories that you control. And So you have to really get people on board to help you get that data, and you are asking them to do additional work, right? So I've always said, from the standpoint of sustainability professionals, if you don't have emotional intelligence and you don't know how to interact well with people, please don't go into this field, because you have to basically get them to work for you and want to do it and care about it. And I think that challenge is often a real difficult one, because they just have other priorities, and it can be very detailed data sometimes. It's HR data, it's risk data, it's certainly the environmental data. So that, and it's so broad and seeps into so many categories of the organization that, you have to have built those relationships in those different parts of the organization. And you have to ask nicely, and you have to sometimes barter for helping them with things. So there's that acquisition of data was challenging from the get-go for me, partly because I wasn't here the year before, but also partly because it's just challenging every year because of the breadth and the depth of it.
Great, thank you for that. And I'm going to end it on this question then. And I'm sorry we're a little bit over, but want to try to get in as many as possible. So you can reach out to us after the call, and we'll field your questions if you have any that we didn't get a chance to talk about today. But ending it with this, the title of our webinar, 60 Days to GRESB. Is there still time to file a report for this year?
Absolutely. You can do it.
Yeah.
Use that grace period. First of all, get rid of the fear, right? Once that fear is gone, look, our plug is we offer a GRESB reporting sort of TurboTax solution for free. Go follow the rubric, follow the steps, click next, next, next. You'll get data in, and you'll get a score back from GRESB, and you'll expose your strengths and weaknesses. And we have examples of having done this for large, complicated portfolios inside 45 days. It's absolutely achievable, so long as you have the expectation that you will not be perfect. All right, so I think it's about expectation setting. It's not about a practical block technologically or mechanically.
Yeah.
Let me, can I build on that, or maybe you get the last word here? I think, as much as I hate to let you do that, but I think, honestly, we did this with CDP, not with GRESB, and CDP also has a, bit of a grace period built into it, and we did it in under 60 days. And I think your last point there, Matt, is really critical. Our first score on CDP out of the gate, it's publicly available, was a D, and frankly, I was pretty happy with that. So not, for where we're headed in terms of trajectory, but certainly for a first year out of the gate, it told us so much about where we had those gaps and where we had a need for improvement, that if you think this stuff, if something has resonated here, that you're getting sort of the gut feeling you should be doing it, then yeah, go do it. And then just keep those expectations, manage the expectations that out of the gate, just getting it done is going to be enough for the year. And then, certainly next year you better improve. But, I think that's a great point, man.
Yeah, I can really, from the investors' perspective, and the investors we speak to, the thing they want to see is participation. Participation in itself at the beginning is absolutely sufficient. And, it's no problem for them if you combine it with the grace period and don't disclose your scores. And I do agree that if I would put in front of me now the reference guide of the GRESB assessment, it's a very, very intimidating piece of writing. And it contains so many things, it covers so many different parts of the organization. But a huge part of this is, do you have this data today, or are you able to report on this? When it comes to data coverage or energy consumption, etc., we to a large degree score the collection of data and the ability to report on it. And I think if you combine this with this grace period, what it means is that you can definitely get started even below 60 days. You enter and complete the information that you have at hand, that is readily available, and it, you know, it effectively prepares you and shows you the gaps, what you will need to collect in coming years. You simply use the grace period, you protect your score, you don't show it with investors, you disclose and signal to the outside world that you took this step and you are reporting on this information. And from there on, really, once that first barrier is taken, which is mostly a barrier of expectations for yourself, doing it the next year and the year after and the year after very naturally will result in improvement in scores, in a very positive storyline that your organization, your portfolio is doing real things to improve your score.
All right, thank you. This is Lou again, and I think the messages get started, and any response is better than zero, no response. Again, thank you to Ulrich, Matt, and Mark today for taking the time out to talk with our network, and thanks for everyone on the call, you know, taking a couple of extra minutes too. A lot of people hung on to listen to the responses here. And we're going to be sending around, you know, the deck. And if anybody has any additional questions or wants to talk with Ulrich, Matt, or Mark, or me, please feel free. We're you know, open to discussions. And I'm going to be aware of everyone's time. We're 10 minutes over, so just again want to say thank you, and hope everybody has a great rest of the day, and hope to hear from you. All right, take care.